Hello, everyone. Welcome to ThinkTech's virtual meetups for the summer season, an initiative organized by the Saudi Ministry of Communications and Information Technology. ThinkTech aims to create a stimulating digital environment and to spread digital awareness about emerging technologies. With this lens, we are happy to introduce a series of meetups that are focused on varying emerging technologies. And today we have the session on AI in government. My name is Ankit Bisht, and I will be your moderator for this session. A quick word about myself. I am a partner with McKinsey & Company, based out of the Middle East. I have had the opportunity and the pleasure to work on the topic of AI and advanced analytics in government over the past decade across Europe and the Middle East. And I have true passion about this topic, especially in terms of helping the lives of citizens and businesses as they navigate through various government services. So today we have a couple of our colleagues with you, experts on this topic from the US. And I would love if they could also introduce themselves to kick us off. Anusha, could you please share a bit about yourself?
Thanks, Ankit. Hi, everybody. My name is Anusha. I'm a partner with McKinsey. I'm based out of Chicago, and I've been with McKinsey the last 10 years. I lead our public sector advanced analytics work globally, and I also do a lot of work with states and local agencies in the US on this topic. So glad to be here.
Perfect. Thank you, Anusha. My name is Sahil. I'm an associate partner from McKinsey Chicago office. Like Anusha, I'm part of the digital practice as well, and I co-lead our public sector advanced analytics service line with her. I have over 10 years of experience in the digital or the AI space, both with tech companies prior to McKinsey and while at McKinsey. And I spend all my time serving US states and local governments on topics of digital data or AI. So super excited to be here today and share some of what we've learned.
Fantastic. Thank you and welcome. So to kick us off, before we even get started with the meat of the questions and the content, there are all of these buzzwords around us: artificial intelligence, advanced analytics, machine learning. What are these buzzwords and how do they come together? And specifically, why should government care and how can they benefit from this?
It's a fantastic question, Ankit. Yeah, let me just start with that, and it's a fantastic question. I think there is a lot of hype around it. We get this question all the time, saying, "How much of this is hype? I can't even get my basic data together to do even simple reporting. Like, don't talk to me about AI." So, but I think if you just boil it down very simply, what is AI, right? It is maximizing the probability of your predictions by enabling your computer as your machine is actually using data to learn and make accurate predictions. It's that's the simplest definition, right? It's about probability maximization using new techniques, using the better processing power that we have at a granularity that humans cannot solve for. So if you think of it from that standpoint, governments make decisions every day, all the time, right? We make decisions on policy, we make decisions on execution, operationalizing it. And we are making those decisions today with mostly human instinct and insight, some amount of data, right? And so I think when your question on why should we care, why should governments care? I think very simply, it's going to allow you to make better decision making across a few major categories, right? It's how do we make policy decisions today? How do we optimize resource allocation, right? So very simple example here is if we are deciding, if you're a caseworker and you have a whole bunch of cases that you need to work through, which ones do I focus on? Which ones are higher risk, right? Which students are at higher risk of dropout that I need to focus on? Experience personalization is another huge area. So just like in the private sector, we did a survey recently. I think a whopping 60% of respondents across private sector said that they're using AI to drive personalization, to drive better experience, to basically drive, in their case, more revenue growth, right? And in the government's case, I think it's all about improving service digitization. In light of COVID, this is obviously amplified, but how do you allow a good citizen experience, right? As you're interacting with the government for various services, and can AI play a part there? And then I could go on and on, but fraud detection is another big area, right? So fraud, waste, and abuse, and reducing that. So it's very interesting because the vast majority of these use cases that I'm talking about are things that governments do every single day. Our research has shown that 80% of AI applications are not new fancy things out there. They're things that people are doing this use cases that are already in place, right? And it's improving that, getting lift on that decision-making power. So I think all of these things, when you think about it, AI can play a fantastic part in helping. And so, yes, should governments care? Absolutely, yes. Our research says almost $1.2 trillion of economic value can be unlocked by applying AI to these existing decisions that we make all the time. And Sahil, if you wanted to add to that.
No, I think you summarized it well, Anusha. Like we have seen governments use AI. Like I have personally also heard multiple states in the US use machine learning or advanced analytics techniques, both in terms of conceptualizing to development to deployment, right? And given the magnitude of dollars that public sector agencies spend and the amount of impact they can have, if you can improve your decision-making ability even by a sliver, it is totally and 100% worth the investment, right? And so AI or advanced analytics gives public sector agencies the opportunity to do that.
Excellent. So what I heard was it basically can help governments become more intelligent across all areas of strategy and operation, decision making, as well as the fact that there is significant value at stake, right? You mentioned 1.2 trillion per annum of value through AI. Could you tell us a bit about what have governments been able to do so far? What kind of use cases have picked up, and where has the value already been seen, even if not across the world, what leading governments are doing? Could you give us a bit of a sense on what are those use cases where AI is already providing some value?
Yeah.
Maybe give us a bit of a sense.
Sure. Let me take the first stab at that, and Anusha, you should jump in too. The way to think about use cases for AI is in two constructs, right? There is existing decisions that governments are making today that you can make better through data, through advanced analytics, through AI. And then there is a set of use cases which were never possible in the past, but you can now make it possible because you have this computational power or the data to make those decisions. And both of those are different, but both have their, and that both sort of have importance and value of its own. And maybe let me take an example, right? We see predictive maintenance as a big use case that both public sector organizations and private sector companies use. Let's take Department of Transportation, for example. Today, every Department of Transportation is making a decision on when and how often they want to go repair a road or a bridge. That decision is being made today by someone. They probably are looking at 3-4 factors like age of the road, how busy is it, et cetera, and making that decision. That very same decision you can make using hundreds of variables. Like you can look at weather patterns, you can look at last 6 months of usage, you can look at the weight of vehicles that go on the roads, and make a smarter decision of when and which road should be maintained, where you would do it proactively versus waiting for it to break down, right? And the outcome you're trying to solve for is how do I reduce any disruption in the services that citizens get using those roads or bridges? On the other hand, let's take a use case which was never possible in the past, right? And let's think of predictive or intelligent traffic lights. You can use image processing algorithms to just very plain and simple, it can check if a certain side of a road has 300 cars waiting versus the other side has 30 cars waiting. And it can use that information to say, maybe I want to let this signal stay green for longer compared to the other side. And during the course of the day, it can adopt or change the duration based on what and how many cars it sees on both sides, right? This particular decision is not being made today. It's like manual. You just set a certain time and the signal stays like that for forever. But using AI, using machine learning, you can make that possible. So that's sort of just to give an example of use cases across both of these categories. Some that we've seen where AI can provide tremendous value. For example, one big one is fraud detection, to what Anusha was mentioning earlier. Every government pays out a ton of benefits, either through unemployment insurance or through medical insurance or other services that governments provide. And every government is aware that there is some amount of fraud or waste in those payments. Given the scale of these payments is so huge, you're paying billions of dollars out every year. If the fraud percentage can be reduced even by 1%, that is enough. And that's where you can get a ton of value out of making better decisions, right? So that's another use case which we see often. Other few use cases, for instance, public finance is the other area. Actually, any agency where resources are constrained and you are trying to allocate them to do work, you can do it better using AI. So public finance, if we take that example, or customs, for example, if you're trying to audit a certain set of cases or certain boxes or packages coming in, how do you select which ones to audit? You could do it randomly. You could do it using 3 or 4 things which most people can keep in their mind, or you can use machine learning or AI to make those decisions better. Right? And you can see tremendous impact there too. Obviously, there's use cases in similar use cases, for example, in education, where you can use AI to predict which students are at some risk of dropping out and then provide them with proactive interventions, right, to make sure that they get the support they need to continue staying in school. You can use one recent one, which we all have probably seen as citizens, is using prediction algorithms to measure spread of infectious diseases, right? So in the public health space, you see a lot of adoption of AI too, because the volume of data is huge. And the only way to actually process all the data and try to make a prediction is using some of these advanced technologies. I can go on and on, but the point is, wherever you're making a decision today, you can make it smarter or better using AI. And then there are these certain set of use cases which you can unlock, which were never possible in the past using these technologies.
The one thing I will add to what Sahil said is the places where we have seen the best deployments, the most value from adoption of AI is not where you're using AI to replace human decision making, but it's almost a human plus machine combination. So use AI to help build decision support, build almost like a recommendation engine, but do not replace the human instinct on top of it. Because in many cases we've seen time and again, the models obviously are more accurate, they get you to a better place, but there is that quality of human judgment, especially if you're a caseworker who really understands the case, or you're a prison supervisor who understands the population. There is going to be that element of human understanding that you're never going to get to perfection on. And then we'll talk later on, I think, about biases and things like that as well, right? And there's a lot of press about that. But our view, our perspective is that when it is a combination of human plus machine, using those deployments of AI have been the most successful in our experience.
That's very, very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Just to summarize, I heard a number of benefits, and the way I see it, it almost impacts all aspects of lives for the end beneficiary, be that the citizen or be that businesses, visitors, etc., that are interacting with government. You talked about saving time, through whether it's transportation optimization, smart mobility. You talked about reducing budget burdens, whether that's CapEx, but in the end, it affects a citizen because you end up paying lesser taxes, or businesses end up paying lesser fees towards that. Better targeting of benefits to really impact those who really need it. So the real poor, the real affected are the ones who end up getting the benefits rather than it's just being a shotgun approach. You talked about personalized interventions. So experience really matters, and people today look for the same experience from government as with private sector. While you can digitize, it's AI that allows you to understand what matters to whom and how to personalize it. So that was very powerful. And finally, you talked about increasing lifespan in terms of health benefits, and so it's about time, it's about money, it's about life, it's about health. So it can government across all of their domains can apply AI to impact the lives of beneficiaries in several different ways. That's amazing. So question: a lot of schools of thought say today that the use of AI is still at its nascency in government, right? But if you look at governments both geographically around the world as well as within a country by different entities or agencies, the overall variation in maturity is significantly high. You have so many dozens of agencies around the world that are just not currently able to capture the value from AI. So why hasn't this taken off at scale across the board already? And what are the barriers that the world is facing from being able to deliver all of these benefits to beneficiaries?
So it's a great question. It's something that I think we deal with all the time, right? If you think of the 4 or 5 building blocks, if you will, to really deploying AI and maximizing value from it, first one is having a very clear vision or strategy in terms of what do you want to do with AI, right? So what are the use cases? Where are we going to focus our efforts? The second is obviously budget, right? Do I have money to invest in this? Third is the data itself, right? And this is a challenge we hear all the time, that we're data poor. We have paper records sitting in a room, right? We don't even have digitized data. So how do we get to that quality and that fit for purpose data that we need for these applications? The fourth is operating model. And so this is actually a pretty huge challenge within an agency, maybe less so, but very often we've found these use cases require data that cut across agencies, right? So the experience you talked about, Ankit, right? Like the typical experience cuts across 5 or 6 different agencies or departments, right? Multiple touch points, multiple channels that a citizen goes through. So how do we bring that data together? So data sharing continues to remain a huge challenge, right, in the government. And I'm not even talking about open data and what do we open up for the public. I'm saying even within the government, right, within agencies, how do you increase that level of sharing? And that operating model around who owns the data, who's responsible for it, what's the governance mechanism around it? How do we make sure it's high quality and accurate? So that's a big area. And then the fifth one is just talent, right? So the data scientists or engineering or whatever talent we need in order to process this data and build those AI use cases. So if you think of all of these areas, I'd say it depends a little bit agency. I've seen some governments do really well on a couple of things, like they're very sharp on which use cases they want, right? Or the operating model is very clear in terms of governance and running it. Some federal agencies in the US, we've seen that. In others, it's actually a lack across the board where they're behind on a number of these aspects. And I'd say the talent is something you can get. You can procure talent. That's probably the lesser of these challenges. Budget is something that can be unlocked, especially if the use cases are shaped the right way and you know what's the value you're going to get from them. But it often comes down to those use cases and vision, right? The quality of the data, and then the operating model is where we time and again see the similar challenges coming up, right? And without those three, the others also become issues. So those are the ones I've seen a lot. And Sahil, if you want to add to that in terms of what you've seen.
Yeah, I think on similar lines, Anusha, the data becomes a huge challenge. And then talent, I feel, is the second most important or the biggest issue. The thing, though, maybe to point out here is it's important to not go and build and get every data element that you would need to build AI and then try to think of the use cases, right? So even if you can, let me put it this way, if you're making a decision today using 5 variables that humans can understand, theoretically, if you could have 100 variables, great. But if you can even do 20, your predictive ability or your decision-making ability will increase a lot. So while I think data is a challenge, it's important to sort of think of what is the MVP, the minimum viable product definition of a model that you can build and get started, because a part of gaining momentum is is delivering value and showing impact. And if you're able to do it, then I think the use case to capture more data, or the business case to capture more data is sort of made by itself.
Excellent. That's very helpful. And I like how you almost shared the entire value chain, across the entire value chain. Where are the bottlenecks or issues in terms of delivery of value? And I do agree. The value definition upfront, oftentimes that vision, the almost approach to be able to figure out where you want to focus in terms of which decisions will bring the most value through AI, I think is often missed, and people go a bit data or technology first into these problems. Sahil, your point around talent being a bottleneck, I think is a very good one. In fact, if you see, maybe it might be a bit lesser so in developed countries, but in developing countries where there's an up and coming private sector, when and how is a government that wants to leapfrog but is in the old ages able to attract talent, competing with the Googles and the other sort of tech giants and industries which are much further ahead in terms of data and AI, and create a real talent value proposition around that. So very much resonates, especially in the region we are in. I love the idea on the minimum viable product that you mentioned, and this concept of fail fast, as it's called in Silicon Valley, of being able to create things in chunks that are both aspirational and delivering real value, but being delivered within a time frame where you're not waiting for the perfect scenario to be created and in the end not delivering anything at all. So I think these concepts are very much I think appreciated and understood across the world. You picked on a point around data availability, quality, and how really that becomes a hindrance in delivering value. Could you tell us a bit more about what can governments do on data, whether it's their own data or external data? Do you have any thoughts on what are the types of initiatives that could potentially unlock the problems that you just stated?
Yeah, let me start with that, Ankit. I think it's a good question, right? Again, it starts with this idea of which domains or which use cases are we really going to focus on, right? Because if we try to solve world hunger on data, it's never going to get done, right? So I like this idea of thinking about what are those thin slices that we're going to build, right? Starting with the use cases down through the data stack to the systems, and really focus on the governance around that and how are we going to drive adoption around it, so that we're almost taking thin slices through the stack and solving the data challenges as we go through that, versus trying to say, okay, I need to integrate all of this data, or I need to solve all of the accuracy issues that we have. So if you think of it in that standpoint, again, it starts with, like we said, what's that very specific, you can almost say, here's my use case list, my top 10 use cases I want to drive. And you then map that to all your key data domains. And you say, these are the domains, or this is the areas where I'm going to really go and try to solve this problem. So I think that's a very important first step that we see a lot of agencies kind of missing sometimes, right? Or they say, no, we've got to go fix our healthcare data. And so then you get into the data swamp, right? It's not a lake anymore, it's a swamp, or it's a data landfill. And it's really hard to kind of bring order or structure into that class. So starting with those thin slices and really making sure that you're getting the data just fit for purpose. Depending on what the application is, you may not need to get to 100% accuracy level, right? Or you may not need millions and millions of records of data, unless you're doing some kind of crazy deep learning algorithm. In most cases, hundreds of thousands of rows of good enough data is often enough to get you enough lift on the AI application. So really thinking about what's that fit for purpose amount of data quality and accuracy that I need, and solving for that. And then the biggest piece is around the governance of the data. So I think just establishing upfront, in the US, we see a lot of IGAs, so intergovernmental agreements, where agencies agree to share data, right? And it's and with many places you'll see challenges there, because I don't want to give up my data. I'm afraid if I give up my data, am I exposing myself to certain risks? So there's a lot of that. So often we find having that a chief data officer kind of role, right, or the CIO role within the agency, kind of making sure that we're dispelling those myths up front. We're not taking away people's data. Agency's data stays with you. we're trying to build a more comprehensive or complete golden record of, of the citizen or of XYZ, so that you can then consume that and you subscribe to it. You can opt into it. It's going to help you, but it's not about taking away ownership or control. So I think a lot of myth dispelling and education has to happen along with it. And so you mentioned talent quite a bit, Ankit. So that's where I have the technical part of doing this is, I think, the least difficult part. Right? You can procure talent, the building of the models itself. I think that's maybe 10% of the effort that's needed. The bigger effort is bringing your stakeholders along, creating that data sharing ecosystem or culture, and then driving the adoption on the back end. So once you have the models, once you have the AI application, how do you make sure people use it? So I think those are probably 95% of the effort in my experience. And the actual crunching, even in developing economies, I think that's something that you can find that talent or you can outsource some of that. But this ecosystem around it is where I think the governments can play a significant role in changing that culture. So hopefully I answered that. I think it's really thinking of those thin slices, but then what's that operating model around it is where I think a lot of work has to happen.
Thank you. Sahil, any thoughts on that?
No, maybe the one thing I will add is there is, along with advancements in algorithms and data processing technology, there is a ton of advancements that has happened in ability for us to extract, transform, and leverage data. You can use, for instance, if you have a stack of paper with like 20 years of historical data, you no longer need a person to enter, actually physically do data entry for each of these, right? You can use technologies like optical character recognition, which will scan these documents and extract data by itself. So there is, you can use robotic process automation or RPA bots to connect data across two systems, right? You no longer need to build text files where you're exchanging data, which was sort of the world in the past. So while, yes, you may, traditionally data was a challenge, right? There are ways to overcome it. And there's actually much better tools to do the traditional ETL or the extract, transform, load process of data that can accelerate your journey towards, or anyone's journey towards, AI.
Very interesting. So what you just said, Sahil, was that we can create data. We don't have to wait for our data to be perfect, or if data doesn't exist, to just not proceed on our AI journey. But rather, if you have let's say decades of blueprints, let's say for construction, and certain, let's say, blueprints that are allowed in terms of construction management as a government, what kind of permits have been given, you can digitize that. If you have health records from your government hospitals that have all kinds of treatments and the type of outcomes that were achieved, you can use AI in optical character recognition to be able to digitize those and then process them using AI. That's an exceptional idea, and it makes me wonder, what are the types of data sets that are gaining traction, which are not necessarily government data sets, but also in private sector that are being starting to use. So do you see some kind of exchange of data between government and private sector to be able to better deliver AI value? We have heard of governments starting to work with telcos and banks. And what have you seen in your part of the world? Have there been any such engagements and interactions?
I think COVID has really amplified some of that, Ankit. So we saw a lot recently with obviously with tracking the spread of the disease, right? Exchanging data with the Googles of the world, trying to track geospatially how people are moving. So I think we're seeing a lot of usage of those kinds of information, especially on the public health standpoint. Mm-hmm. And then I think on fraud and abuse, things like that, there's starting to be more exchange as well, right? I haven't seen the scale that I think you are alluding to, right, where it is truly collaborative and you're exchanging data. So for example, on fraud, waste, and abuse, you could see a lot of potential for collaboration as well, right, benefiting both actors. We haven't seen that yet take off, but in specific areas like public health, I think we're seeing a lot more collaboration and exchange of information.
We have a question the audience that I'd like to maybe shift to, which takes us a little bit from the benefits of AI to the risks of AI. We'll come back to the benefits, I promise, because
Yeah.
that's also fun. But um, implementing AI has its own risks. The question specifically is asking about how is accountability managed for decisions made by AI systems, which can oftentimes be autonomous. If you could maybe help us paint the picture on what are the risks of AI, and specifically when you are allowing machines to make certain decisions, how can that be managed and who really has the accountability for that? So I'd love if you could paint for us the big picture and also answer this specific question.
Yeah, let me start maybe with that big picture, and then we can go into that specific question. So, two nuances, Ankit, before we go into what are the risks, right? Like, yes, AI or machine learning is risky, but the risk isn't in the technology by itself. The risk is in decision making, right? I would argue like most of the decisions are being made today as well. And in some cases, you may find out that it actually is more risky to make those decisions without data than with leveraging data. Um, so it's I think that's the one nuance. The second piece is what Anusha said in previously on the call. We are not seeing or we are seeing very few instances in the public sector, at least, where AI is used to make decision by itself, like autonomously. That is not, at least not present right now in from what we have seen. Where we see AI be actually a lot more helpful and how it is deployed or leveraged is where it acts as a decision support, where the final decision still rests with the individual, to either agree with the recommendation or to override it. And actually, overriding the recommendation is sometimes very helpful. So you can use that data to retrain and improve AI over time. Right? And maybe let me take the example that I was referring to earlier, even forward, right? So if you're using AI for predictive maintenance, let's say for a road, and hypothetically, if you do not repair a road, right? And something happens, right? Like, who does that accountability sit with, right? Like that's the question. First, you're making that decision today as well, right? So adding AI inherently doesn't take away the risk of the decision. You are today deciding which road to repair or not, and so you are missing maybe some roads, you're getting some roads, and so that risk exists today. Also, in this situation, the way I would implement it is actually build a model which gives a recommendation saying, here's the 5 roads I would repair in the next 3 months, here's the 5 I would not, or here's the next set of 5, and then here's the 5 that seem in a good state, right? But it is not, I would still share this recommendation with the road safety engineer, with the chief engineer of DOT, right? They will know the roads in some cases better than the AI, right? And so they should say, yes, these 5 decisions make sense. But this one decision, you know what, this road, I know, just contextually, I'm aware that this needs a repair more often than some of the other roads. And hence, even though the recommendation is to maybe repair it 6 months later, I think we should go ahead and do it right now, right? So it's the combination of the machine making getting you to maybe 80 or 90% there, and then human judgment or human decision getting you to the last 10%, which will get you to the most accurate output in this situation.
May I ask a bit, the use case you mentioned around roads, when it's about assets, it's one thing. When you start getting towards use cases that are affecting the lives of people, so you mentioned targeting of benefits. What if, because of your algorithm, certain people who should get the benefit don't, right? That, I guess you mentioned, maybe, it would be worse if you weren't using AI. But what if your algorithm, and we've seen this happen around the world, you probably know of examples where, because it's such a black box, you just don't understand why it is saying what it is saying as an answer, and you end up having certain biases. So can you tell us about what are the risks when it is people that are associated, and how can that be managed, even because the whole accountability question becomes 10 times bigger when it's people at stake rather than assets.
Asset. Yeah, no, okay, that's a very good very good point. And yes, public sector organizations will have to make decisions that touch people, right? So it's sort of unavoidable in the context that we are all, or public sector agencies are working on. I think there is three things that you mentioned, and I will add two more, right? Like the first one is accuracy. So what happens if you miss a certain individual who needed benefits? The machine learning models or AI models are expected to be more accurate than traditional decision making, and that's how you should measure them, right? Like when you build or deploy a model, you would measure the performance of the model compared to historical data and see if you're seeing an improvement in your ability to predict a certain outcome or not, right? I think the second way is you need to identify which mistakes are more costly than others. So let's take example of education. If you write an algorithm or a model to decide which student should get counselor intervention because they are at risk of dropping out from graduation, right? In this situation, a mistake of maybe missing a student who needs help is, you could think that the mistake of missing a student who needs help is a lot more costly than maybe falsely tagging an individual who does not need help, but fine, would not hurt if he gets more help, right? So in this case, you would design an algorithm to solve for false negatives, right? Like you really don't want somebody who the model says he doesn't need help, he or she, and they actually do need help. While slightly, if the model is not super accurate for true positives, that's okay, right? If one or two people get tagged additionally, that's fine. So where I'm going with this is you need to identify what are the mistakes that are most important for the model to solve. Where do you want the model to be as precise or as accurate as it could be? And then accordingly develop the model with that approach. And then second is always measure how the model is performing relative to the past. Because in this exact same situation, you are today making the same decision, you probably are making it worse than you would make it tomorrow with data. It's not going to be 100% accurate. No machine learning model will be 100% accurate, right? But if you had 80% accuracy in the past and you can get to 90% accuracy in the future, it is still worth the investment to get there. And slowly over time, you get from 90 to 92 to 94 and so on. I think the second point you mentioned was, or the second big area of risk when it comes to machine learning models is bias, right? And that can be, there is like hundreds of ways you can define bias. The important thing to note here is, by the way, bias, just maybe to ground everyone, is in case the model is better at predicting for a certain protected class versus the other, right? It could be race, it could be gender, it could be age. Like for instance, there were examples of organizations who used AI to shortlist resumes for job applications. And after they deployed it, they realized that historically, given most of the applicants were male, the model, which was trained on historical data, was clearing more male applicants than females, right? So this is bias by gender, right? And it's important. First, it's very, very important to talk about it and make sure and consciously know that, yes, this may exist, right? And then there are ways to overcome and manage bias, right? You need to recognize what are the different protected classes. In this case, it's gender. In the same example, it could be race, it could be other protected classes. You want to make sure that your model is equally fair or equally unfair across different protected classes, right? And the trade-off is very real. So you can get a model which is more accurate overall, but it predicts more accurately for one protected class versus the other, right? It's maybe to explain it in a different way, it's where everyone gets richer, but the gap between rich and poor increases, right? So everyone is getting better decisions, but the model is making so much better decisions for one segment of the population than the other that they inherently get some sort of an advantage, right? you can avoid that. There are technical ways to avoid it, where you subset the data, you only include partial historical data, not all of the data. You measure for this bias. But I think the macro point is you identify, one, recognize that there could be bias, two, define what bias you are worried about, and then three, use technical mechanisms to minimize algorithmic bias. There's like a ton of research on how you can reduce algorithmic bias. You just have to make sure that you're conscious about it and leveraging it as you build machine learning models. Maybe the last thing I will add, and then Anusha, you should jump in. Ankit, you mentioned another point around machine learning or AI being black box. Yes. While that is the case for some of the complex models, there are simpler models that are not as black box as the more complex deep learning models, right? So for instance, you can build decision trees, you can build random forest models, and on top of those tree-based decision models or forest-based decision models, you can build specific explainability tools. Basically what it does is it says, hey, the model is predicting that this road is likely to need repair. And the reasons it is saying that is because of these four factors, right? Like these four variables were the most important in the model's ability to predict. So that not only allows you to see why the model is predicting, but you could override it, right? So if, for instance, this one says, because the road did not have a lot of vehicular movement in the last 6 months, we don't think it needs repair. But maybe you know that the CCTV camera on that road was not installed and hence there was no vehicular movement, right? I'm making this up, but there may be contextual things beyond the data that the road engineer would know and hence could override it. So there are explainability tools that can be leveraged and should be leveraged to make these models non-black box. And then you will have to make a trade-off at some point between using extremely complex model that may be slightly more accurate versus simpler models that are more explainable.
And I think, Sahil, you covered it, right? I would just add, I'll just add that, there's, when we think of AI use cases, there's a lot of hype around algorithmic bias and, is the algorithm going to stand in court and answer for the decisions, blah, blah, blah. So, but I just, taking a step back, there's a whole bunch of applications for AI which don't involve these kinds of, higher risk situations. So even just very simply using NLP, right, or chatbots or things like that that drive experience improvements, that is also AI. And then cases where we are going to get into more of this trickier territory, so to speak, I think treading carefully and having a very clear upfront set of objectives. What are we solving for? And thinking of this as not just a one-time thing, but it's living models that we're going to keep retraining. And it's human plus machine. We're not replacing decision-making, we're supplementing human decision-making. I think thinking of it in that way, we've seen a lot of places where even just thinking about this upfront, right? This question of who are the different groups and how are we going to ensure fairness across these groups? How fair are we today, right? Do we go back and look at our decisions that we've been making? So to take a US example, recent example, like in courts, right? The sentencing decisions we've been making, how fair are we today? Based on, judges and people making those calls. How do we want to define this in the future? Even asking those questions, right? Keeping AI aside completely, I think this is actually unlocking a lot of that thinking upfront, saying, what kind of system do we want to design, right? How are our policies supporting or hurting that kind of fairness? And then you can get into the mechanics of, do we use AI for this? Does it make it better? Does it not? In some cases, you might find the data is not good enough. We're not going to go down the path of AI, but at least you're unlocking those questions up front. So we're finding that itself is actually a lot of value to start with, because you'll find many agencies don't even question that today, right? Like, do we go back and look retrospectively on how fair our fairness metrics, or do we even define that? Because obviously there's fear of litigation and things that might come with it. But asking those questions up front and starting to design accordingly, I think is itself a big step for a lot of different agencies. But it's a great question and something we'll have to keep thinking about, right, as we go forward, which is who's accountable for this? And ultimately, if there is a mistake in the algorithm or something that goes wrong, how do we drive that, right? Who's accountable for it? So that's going to be a question, I think, of our times, is because AI is now mainstream and it will continue to grow in adoption.
That's excellent, and a great provocative thought on how fair are we today. And that could be the starting point to think about why you do want to use AI. But just to maybe summarize what I heard you say that first of all, there is always accountability for decisions that you end up making, whether you make it autonomously through AI or you make it through human sort of actions, or you make it through a mix. It's important that governments understand that, and at the highest level, there are a couple of things. One, in terms of being transparent, thinking about where things could go, whether in court or just in terms of the negative or biased impact that you could achieve. But secondly, also to define domains where there are risks versus there are not, right? Where there are more potential sort of negative impacts versus not, and clearly go full speed ahead where there are lesser risks of bias and negative impact. But even in areas where there is some risk, tread carefully. Think about the type of human plus machine combinations you can bring in to make sure that you are not making judgments or decisions that are not up to the mark, right? So you can do certain things in terms of treading more carefully. Within these domains where there are risks, I heard of a few very interesting technical answers as well from both of you in terms of how you can think about reducing the risk and therefore the accountability of making wrong decisions. You talked about really dissecting and figuring out where are the mistakes that will cost you more. So being able to identify that and making sure you don't make mistakes in those particular areas. Secondly, you talked about understanding your protected classes and therefore making sure that biases towards them are not in place. And there are ways to do that. And you can use various techniques to understand how well are you doing in terms of improving or, hurting certain decisions, protected classes, and just making sure that you are helping everyone or not helping everyone, but all of it is done in a consistent way across your protected classes. Thirdly, what I heard was making choiceful decisions on which algorithms to go for based on their openness, their explainability. And on top of that, using certain tools or approaches that are now you're able to build in terms of explainability tools on top of that to be able to explain why the model gave the answer it did, and using that as part of your judgment to be able to go with that answer or not. I think these were three ways that you explained, which were very powerful, and really I think hit home the point that there are areas to tread carefully, but there are definitely ways government can be conscious and adapt to these risks. Excellent. Take
In
one
our
more.
view, sorry,
Yeah.
Ankit, just
No, please.
our view is always, by the way, that autonomous decision making, I don't think we're ready for that, right? So I think just on your first point, with the vast majority of cases, we would say that it has to ultimately, whatever the AI is recommending, be seen by a human at some point, especially in these more complex areas, right? But even in some of the others. So that's generally our perspective in all of these. So, and I don't know if this question has come up or not, but linked to that, then we've had questions on, okay, is AI now going to displace my people, right? And so is there going to be a workforce challenge that comes with this? And again, our answer is no, because we're not seeing this as replacing. Yes, it's going to make people's lives easier. It's going to make employees of the government their lives easier because they're not spending a whole bunch of time knitting data together or stitching it or trying to find patterns. So it's going to reduce some of that the time spent looking at that. But we are not seeing this as a replacement in all the work that we're doing. You're on mute.
Yeah, you might be on mute.
Apologies. So it's a disruption, not necessarily a replacement for human talent. Excellent. One question to move back towards the benefits, or at least how we can get to the benefits. Do you have certain tips or tricks for what government agencies can do? If I'm a new, let's say, chief AI officer or chief data officer tasked with, uplifting the decision making in my government organization using data and AI, what are the tips and tricks that you would give them, and how would you tell them to go about it to be able to maybe skip some of the hurdles that you had mentioned earlier?
Yeah, maybe I can start this answer, and Anusha, you should pile on. The first and most important tip in my mind is to have a use case backed approach, right? There's two ways you can tackle the AI problem. One is, let me go collect all the data, let me build a data lake, and then I will figure out how best I can use it. Or you say, let me figure out how I want to use this data. What are the three decisions that I want to make better in the next 1 year? And then let me go collect the data needed for those decisions and then build the model for those. And over time, over the next like few months to a few years, you keep building those use cases, and hence you keep building the data. Right? Our strong view, a strong bias is towards the latter approach, where you look at the 2 or 3 decisions that you want to make, collect the data needed for those decisions, and start there. Right. What it also helps, particularly with public sector, where you see leaders change at a certain cadence of time, it allows you to deliver value early and often. Right. You can meaningfully deliver value or improve your decision making in a matter of 3 to 6 months. Right. We are not talking years. If you just pick 2 decisions you want to make better, get the data associated with that, build the model and deploy it, right? Or test the deployment of it. It can be very quick that you can start to see results and improvements and actual benefits to citizens or to your financial statements, and very, very quickly without investing millions of dollars, right? So that I think just like starting and having that use case back mindset or approach is probably the most important tip that I would give. I think the second piece is think about adoption from day one. To a point that Anusha made previously in the presentation, building the machine learning model is a matter of maybe 2 months, 3 months, right? It's a matter of 3 engineers, 2 data scientists, a couple of designers sitting in a room and writing this, right? It will not be the most challenging aspect of this entire journey. The more challenging aspect will be, how do you bring your frontline staff along to begin to trust some of the counterintuitive insights that AI will present, and leverage it in their day-to-day operations. So the way to maybe consider going on this journey is use on and bring in your frontline staff in this process of building AI from day one, right? Get a brainstorming session with them, bring them in the room, ask them what are the factors you look at today to make your decisions, right? And then that is the starting point for what should be the factors that you should begin to train your models from. But if you're co-creating these with your frontline staff, adoption becomes extremely easier, and that will go a long way when you actually have a model which maybe sometimes will for sure give counterintuitive results, right? There is no model which will be exactly the same, giving you the same decisions that humans made in the past. Two other maybe quick points. The third thing is, do not run or do AI in isolation in a bubble, right? Like most agencies will think, let's create a center of excellence and then let's have that center of excellence keep building AI models or machine learning models, right? While that is a great way and probably the best way to incubate these new technologies, you need to make sure that they work very, very closely with the business, right? Or with the agencies, whether it's public finance or customs or transportation, right? Like it cannot be a technology or chief data officer only run initiative. It needs to be a joint initiative between the technology, the AI or data group, as well as the agencies who are responsible for running the business. And then last thing is always, maybe I will take a private sector example just to switch things a little, right? When you think of, if you think of the soda manufacturers, right? If you're I remember one use case where they were able to predict demand accurately up to 90%, right? And then they used AI to improve that prediction ability from 90 to 92%. That 2% lift was enough to materially, like meaningfully make hundreds of millions of dollars impact on their financial statement. Where I'm going with this is you do not need to build a machine learning or AI model that needs to be 100% accurate, right? You can get meaningful improvement improvement in your prediction ability to go from 80% to 90%. And that is enough to start making or taking the first step, right? Like don't let perfect be the enemy of good. As long as you're able to see, you will still get 10x or 100x ROI on the money you spend, as long as there is improvement given the scale that public sector operates in. I think those are some lessons learned from the front line that I wanted to share. Anusha, Ankit, you guys may have some of your own too.
No, I think you covered it.
Okay, excellent. So what I heard there was actually fascinating, because you spend so much time on frontline staff and really being able to embed this in your operations where it matters. People who make decisions, people who deliver services, people who are actually interacting with your end customers. You also mentioned extensively about being close to the business, not doing this in isolation. So again, coming back to where is the value, and do you have that sponsorship, either the CEO or top business level sponsorship, to be able to ensure this is just not a statistician or a mathematician in the background doing his crunching, but rather a business wanting to change its operating model based on data and being able to work in new ways and bring change to their entire organization. Specifically, maybe just we have a few minutes, but specifically on the front line, have you seen any initiatives when we are saying bringing change at scale in the front line? What are some of the organizations doing? Are they doing trainings or podcasts, academies? What have you seen work in terms of being able to build a different culture or mindset for acceptance of analytics and AI in government organizations?
Yeah, let me take a stab at that as well. I think it's a multitude of what you said, Ankit. One of them for sure is improving data literacy across the organization, right? So trying to make sure everyone understands the value that data can provide and what kind of data do we have, how can you leverage it to make some of the decisions you do better. I think two is involving the frontline staff in the process from day one. You cannot build a machine learning model and then give it to a frontline engineer and say, hey, use this, right? Like it will not, it's going to be very unlikely that will be accepted. And so involving them from day one in co-creating the answer will be important. I think training goes a long way. Constant reinforcement from leadership that yes, this is the direction we want to take will go a long way. Right? It's hard in public sector context to incentivize people to go a certain way versus not, but private sector organizations use incentive to reinforce some sort of behavior. So that's the other dimension. But if you have the leadership buy-in and leaders are willing to change and role model that behavior, if you give the right training to the frontline staff, and if you involve them from day one through the journey, I think the combination of these three measures will enable you to make the change process easier. It's still going to be the most challenging aspect of this journey, right? Don't get me wrong, but it will make it easier. And then at the end of the day, if the frontline employees see the value in it, right? Like they see the benefits, it will, if you're able to do it in a way that it actually saves time for them, it makes their lives easier, it allows them to do their job better, that will go a meaningful amount, that will help meaningfully as well in making sure adoption happens.
Fantastic. Look, would love to continue this discussion as there's so much more to discuss. But as we're running out of time, I think we have to wrap up now. We've learned a lot today, from understanding the benefits of AI, from saving lives and time and money for governments, all the way to what are the biggest bottlenecks that governments face and how they can unlock them. We also talked about the dark side, which is around the risks and how to really manage those risks as government, because the accountability is still with them on the final decisions that are being made. And finally, thank you for the final tips and tricks that can allow governments and organizations make the leap and really make AI in their organization a success. This has been a fascinating discussion. I would like to thank everyone who was watching for joining us and the questions that came in. And thank you, Anusha and Sahil, for taking the time today. It was a great discussion, and really appreciate you making it. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for the Ministry of Communication and Information Technology for these virtual meetups. And we look forward to the next session.